Yeah.
That I mean, he's saying something that scientists figured out 30, 40 years later. And what he's saying is that reflective particles suspended in the atmosphere can protect you from radiation.
Right.
Well, the thing about gold is unlike any other metal.
In the quest for knowledge about the Anunnaki, most of us have confronted the basic but legitimate questions about gold and the Anunnaki need for it. Why did the Anunnaki need gold? Why did they not simply manufacture the gold? Why not mine gold from asteroids instead of Earth? Why manipulate DNA to create human miners instead of building robots? Not only do students of the hypothesis grapple with these queries, but critics of the hypothesis manipulate these questions in debate and other debunking efforts. But since these are in fact legitimate questions, especially for the folks that are new to the theory, the archive presents some answers that will hopefully provide reasonable explanations, not to mention effective retorts to the critics and debunkers. Why did the Anunnaki need gold? The question and its answer may seem obvious, but with deeper consideration and retrospection, the answer becomes more profound. The Anunnaki are believed to be an extraterrestrial race from a planetary mass identified as Nibiru, located in the outer reaches of our solar system. Atra-Hasis explains, the leader of the astronauts who had come to Earth from Nibiru, we know from numerous ancient texts, was called Ea, whose house is water. After he had landed and established Eridu, the first Earth station, he assumed the title Enki, Lord of Earth. A text that was discovered in the ruins of Sumer records his landing on Earth as a first-person report. When I approached Earth, there was much flooding. When I approached its green meadows, heaps and mounds were piled up at my command. I built my house in a pure place. My house, its shade stretches over the Snake Marsh. The text then proceeds to describe Enki's efforts to build extraordinary waterworks in the marshlands at the head of the Persian Gulf. He surveyed the marshlands, cut canals for drainage and water control, built dikes, dug ditches, and built structures of bricks molded from the local clays. He joined the Tigris and Euphrates rivers by canals, and at the edge of the marshlands he built his waterhouse, with a wharf and other facilities. It all had a reason. On his planet, gold was needed, not for jewelry or another frivolous use, for at no time during the millennia that followed were these visitors to Earth ever shown wearing golden jewelry. Gold was no doubt required for the space programs of the Nibiruans, as is evident from the Hindu text references to the celestial chariots being covered with gold. Indeed, gold is vital to many aspects of the space instruments and vehicles of our own times. But that alone could not have been the reason for the intensity of the Nibiruans' search for gold on Earth, and their immense efforts to obtain it here and transfer it in large quantities to their own planet. The metal, with its unique properties, was needed back home for a vital need, affecting the very survival of life on that planet. As best as we can make out, the vital need could have been for suspending the gold particles in Nibiru's waning atmosphere and thus shield it from critical dissipation. So the simplest answer to this seemingly simple question is, they needed to repair their atmosphere on Nibiru. This answer of course begs the next question. Why did the atmosphere need repair? Researcher Andy Lloyd makes a noteworthy observation. One of the most curious things about Atra-Hasis' theories is his description of the Anunnaki's search for gold. Their descent to Earth was triggered by a worsening environmental disaster on their own world, Nibiru. They came here with the explicit need to collect one thing, gold. Why? Not for jewelry, certainly. Their plundering of the Earth's gold supplies was necessary in order to achieve just one end. They needed to pump the stuff into the atmosphere of Nibiru. This is one of the strangest aspects of a very strange story. Nowadays, we are all familiar with the idea of environmental threats, of impending ecological collapse within a couple of generations. But when Sitchin wrote his 12th Planet Theory back in 1976, there was no such concern, beyond worries of oil prices and OPEC's control of the world's economy. When we move forward 40+ years, we can observe humans here on our own planet developing the science of geoengineering, whereby we initiate large-scale intervention in the Earth's natural systems to counteract climate change. Within this segment of the science community, we find intensive research being conducted on solar radiation management. SRM techniques aim to reflect a small proportion of the sun's energy back into space, counteracting the temperature rise caused by increased levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere which absorb energy and raise temperatures. And one of these techniques sounds awfully familiar: stratospheric aerosols, the introduction of small, reflective particles into the upper atmosphere to reflect some sunlight before it reaches the surface of the Earth. Perhaps the Anunnaki were attempting to achieve the same solution. Perhaps the purpose of the gold was not to keep Nibiru's heat in, but to keep the light out. It is at this level that this simple question can blossom into an intricate subset of queries. This is also the level at which critics and debunkers engage most often. The majority of queries center around the nature of Nibiru itself and what type of planetary mass would exist in such an extreme elliptical orbit. Traditionally, the planet Marduk was described as a captured mass from another system. Other plausible theories include binary star systems and even Dyson's spheres. In fact, there exists a ton of research, data, and observation that establishes the plausibility of Nibiru's existence. And indeed, it is a very easy argument to say the Anunnaki quest for gold is nonsense when one eliminates the existence of Nibiru. But the truth is, the existence of a large planetary mass hidden in our solar system cannot be summarily dismissed, as the critics and debunkers would have you believe. Another fundamental question regarding the Anunnaki necessity for gold is why they did not simply manufacture the gold. Before we dive into the answer, let's go back to our context, which begins over 430,000 years ago. At that time on the Earth, if modern-day humans showed up, even with our current level of technology, we would be considered gods by the indigenous populations. It is entirely plausible that the first generations of Anunnaki to come to Earth were not much more technologically developed than we are nowadays. Indeed, interplanetary travel is within our current capacity, as well as DNA and gene editing technologies. In fact, we can now manufacture our own gold. Chrysopia is the artificial production of gold, which is made possible in particle accelerators or nuclear reactors. However, the production cost is currently many times the market price of gold. Perhaps the Anunnaki had the same exact issue with cost prohibitions. Perhaps it was still easier and faster to locate natural deposits, even if they were off-planet. And of course, that answer leads us right into our next question. Why not mine gold from asteroids instead of Earth? As far as we know, most of the gold in the universe is created in neutron star collisions, and that means gold is quite rare. However, significant amounts can be found located in small masses such as asteroids. In fact, there's a lot of money floating around in space. In the Kuiper Belt, one asteroid alone, named 16 Psyche, is worth an estimated 10,000 quadrillion dollars. That's this number. So if there is that much out there, why did the Anunnaki not mine the asteroids? Well, let's back up 1 second. We do not know for a fact that they did not mine the asteroids also. The scant records we currently have written on 4,000-year-old tablets may not be the whole story, and the Anunnaki may have indeed attempted to mine gold from other acquisition targets. In short, We cannot rule it out, but we can certainly rule in their efforts here on Earth to obtain gold through terrestrial mining. The aggregate amount of gold that could be potentially mined from asteroids is much greater than the sum total of Earth, but that is probably not how the Anunnaki perceived it. Regardless of the cumulative total found in asteroids, the Earth represented a singular destination with vast quantities of gold. It also had the added benefit of an atmosphere and gravity. So if your basic choice was between building a massive mechanized fleet of automated mining rigs or setting up shop on a planet that allowed for extremely prolonged and comfortable habitation with a potential source of labor, which would you choose? And again, the archive iterates that nothing negates the possibility they in fact did both. Now we arrive at perhaps the most frequently asked question regarding the Anunnaki and gold. Why manipulate DNA to create human miners instead of building robots? Before we proceed, the archive would like to point out that this specific question is asked less by those individuals beginning their study of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, and much more by those individuals attempting to quickly dismiss the hypothesis without any serious level of critical thinking applied to the query. In fact, it has been the archive's experience that even some skeptics consider the answer so obvious that they simply move on to more difficult and serious questions. Nevertheless, the archive will directly address it so as to answer the sincere queries of the beginners, and perhaps more importantly, to call out the debunkers and trolls. And what better way to call out the trolls and debunkers than to use an actual sample of how they pose the query? Max360 commented on the video Evidence of the Anunnaki. Quote, "Let me get this straight. This advanced alien race created technology that allowed them to fly their spaceships to Earth, and once they got here, they decided to make human slaves to dig for gold. That makes no sense whatsoever. Why wouldn't they create robots or use AI to dig for it if they were so damned advanced? Your theory holds no water." End quote. When the archive receives this type of query, we obviously know the intent of the individual immediately. We know this individual either believes that this approach is successful in debunking the hypothesis, or he or she has never actually applied any level of critical analysis to its probable answer. And in most cases, both attributes are true. Also, for the record, it is not the archive's theory. The archive would never attempt such hubris. Anyway, most debunkers and pop culture drones alike have so much Hollywood ingrained in their brain that they equivocate this history to their sensationalized view of the world. In their mental space, they summon images of a fleet of spaceships like the movie Independence Day, or maybe even an Imperial Star Destroyer from Star Wars. It is from that simplified and completely erroneous mental premise that they launch forth, submitting the query as if they have actually applied logic to their approach of the subject. Technically, this is a two-part question. So let's first tackle the part about artificial intelligence and robots. As is the case with most debunkers, Max360 has little to zero knowledge of Sitchin's thesis. Shortly after he arrived on Earth, Enki did in fact utilize artificial intelligence in his gold acquisition effort. Sitchin explains the following. Now this is the account of how the searching for gold was begun. After the encampment of Eridu was established and the heroes with food were satiated, Ea, the task of gold from the waters obtaining, started. In the chariot the firestones were stirred up, its great cracker was enlivened. That which water sucks from the chariot was extended, into the marsh waters it was inserted. Into a vessel of crystals the waters were directed. From the waters the crystals all that is metal in the vessel extracted. Then from the vessel that which spits out the waters to the fish pond spat out. Thus were the metals that were in the waters in the vessel collected. Of the gold, the smallest pile was accumulated. The swampland's waters are deficient. Let the chariot to the deeper ocean be moved, so was Ea saying. From its moorings was the chariot untied, back whence it came it was shifted. With great care were the crystal vessels stirred up, the salt waters through them passing. Metals by their kinds were separated, Gold among them was sparkling. As it turns out, however, Enki could not produce sufficient quantities of gold using this method, and subsequently reverted to terrestrial mining. So, if water extraction technology failed, why not create robots to do the mining at that point? First of all, the possession of advanced technology does not necessarily or logically lead to the production of robots on a planet without any infrastructure whatsoever. Nor does it lead logically to loading up tens of thousands of robots on Nibiru for transportation to Earth. Second, the Anunnaki did in fact likely utilize mechanized technology in their mining efforts. Sitchin explains the use of mechanized technology in this passage. Where to obtain gold from Earth's bowels he, Enki, then determined. What heroes to the task are needed he calculated. What tools were required he contemplated. An earth splitter with cleverness Enki designed. On Nibiru that it be fashioned he requested. Therewith in the earth to make a gash, its innards reach by way of tunnels. That which crunches and that which crushes he also designed on Nibiru for the Abzu to be fashioned. As we can see, the Anunnaki did in fact apply advanced technology to their mining efforts on Earth. However, there does not seem to be a record of the use of thousands of robots in the African mines. But that makes perfect logical sense. The most likely, yet albeit simple, answer is that they did not have the room to transport thousands of units. It is also worth considering that such advanced robots would likely require maintenance at a level that would not be feasible for the small groups of Anunnaki on Earth. Additionally, such technology would require renewable power sources which would not be available on an undeveloped planet. Some might argue that even Earthlings have solar-powered rovers on Mars, so why would it not be feasible? Well, without getting into the difference between a bipedal humanoid robot performing complex forms of physical labor and a remote-controlled Mars rover, let's just say the power requirements would be enormously different. So, in understanding that the Anunnaki arrival on Earth was not some imperial invasion of thousands of stormtroopers, we can apply Occam's razor here and determine that they likely did not use robots because they simply could not. They did not have the capacity to do so at the time. On the more sinister side, there is perhaps another reason the Anunnaki did not wish to rely on robotics and AI from the very beginning. And we can sum it up in one word: Terminator. Now let's address the second part. Why manipulate primate DNA to create homo-sapien workers? Surmising that it was not feasible for the Anunnaki to provide automation of the mining operations at an appreciable scale, it looks to be a matter of Bayesian logic as to why they chose to manipulate primate DNA. Observing the indigenous life of Earth led Enki to assign a high probability of success to the primate life form known as Homo erectus. In order to understand Enki's logic, the viewer must again have a complete context. According to the Sumerians, life was brought into the solar system by Nibiru. It was Nibiru that imparted the seed of life to Earth during the celestial battle with Tiamat. Enki thought Homo erectus possibly evolved on Earth from Nibiruan genes delivered when Nibiru invaded the solar system. Here is how Zecharia Sitchin explains it. It happened, we learn from such long text as the Atra-Hasis, when the rank-and-file astronauts who had come to Earth for its gold mutinied. The backbreaking work in the gold mines in Southeast Africa had become unbearable. Enlil, their commander-in-chief, summoned the ruler of Nibiru, his father Anu, to an assembly of the great Anunnaki and demanded harsh punishment of his rebellious crew. But Anu was more understanding. "What are we accusing them of?" he asked as he heard the complaints of the mutineers. Their work was heavy, their distress was much. Was there no other way to obtain the gold? He wondered out loud. "Yes," said his other son Enki, Enlil's half-brother and rival, the brilliant chief scientist of the Anunnaki. "It is possible to relieve the Anunnaki of the unbearable toil by having someone else take over the difficult work. Let a primitive worker be created." The idea appealed to the assembled Anunnaki. The more they discussed it, the more clear their clamor grew for such a primitive worker, an Adamu, to take over the workload. But they wondered, how can you create a being intelligent enough to use tools and to follow orders? How was the creation or bringing forth of the primitive worker to be achieved? Was it indeed a feasible undertaking? A Sumerian text has immortalized the answer given by Enki to the incredulous assembled Anunnaki who saw in the creation of Adamu the solution to their unbearable toil. The creature whose name you uttered, it exists. All you have to do, he added, is to bind upon it the image of the gods. In these words lies the key to the puzzle of man's creation, the magical wand that removes the conflict between evolution and creationism. The Anunnaki, the Elohim of the biblical verses, did not create man from nothing. The being was already there on earth, the product of evolution. All that was needed to upgrade it to the required level of ability and intelligence was to bind upon it the image of the gods, the image of the Elohim themselves. The process envisioned by Enki was to bind upon the existing creature the image, the inner genetic makeup of the Anunnaki, in other words, to upgrade the existing ape-man, ape-woman through genetic manipulation, and thus, by jumping the gun on evolution, bring man, homo sapiens, into being. There is reason to believe that when Enki made the surprising suggestion to create a primitive worker through genetic manipulation, he had already concluded that the feat was possible. His suggestion to call in Ninti for the task was also not a spur-of-the-moment idea. Laying the groundwork for ensuing events, the Atra-Hasis text begins the story of man on Earth with the assignment of tasks among the leading Anunnaki. When the rivalry between the two half-brothers, Enlil and Enki, reached dangerous levels, Anu made them draw lots. As a result, Enlil was given mastery over the old settlements and operations in the Eden, the biblical Eden, and Enki was sent to Africa to supervise the Abzu, the land of mines. Great scientist that he was, Enki was bound to have spent some of his time studying the flora and fauna of his surroundings, as well as the fossils that, some 300,000 years later, the Leakeys and other paleontologists have been uncovering in southeastern Africa. As scientists do today, Enki too must have contemplated the course of evolution on Earth. As reflected in the Sumerian text, he came to the conclusion that the same seed of life that Nibiru had brought with it from its previous celestial abode had given rise to life on both planets, much earlier on Nibiru and later on Earth, once the latter had been seeded by the collision. The being that surely fascinated him most was Ape-Man, a step above the other primates, a hominid already walking erect and using sharpened stones as tools, and a proto-man, but not yet fully evolved human. And Enki must have toyed with the intriguing challenge of playing God and conducting experiments in genetic manipulation. To aid his experiments, he asked Ninti to come to Africa and be by his side. The official reason was plausible. She was the chief medical officer. Her name meant Lady Life. Later on, she was nicknamed Mami, the source of the universal mama/mother. There was certainly a need for medical services, considering the harsh conditions under which the miners toiled. But there was more to it. From the very beginning, Enlil and Enki vied for her sexual favors, for both needed a male heir by a half-sister, which she was. The three of them were children of Anu, the ruler of Nibiru, but not of the same mother, and according to the succession rules of the Anunnaki, later adopted by the Sumerians, and reflected in the biblical tales of the patriarchs, it was not necessarily the firstborn son, but a son born by a half-sister from the same royal line who became the legal heir. Sumerian texts describe torrid lovemaking between Enki and Ninti. With unsuccessful results, though, the offspring were all females. There was thus more than an interest in science that led Enki's suggestion to call in Ninti and assign the task to her. Knowing all this, we should not be surprised to read in the creation text that first, Ninti said she could not do it alone, that she had to have the advice and help of Enki, and second, that she had to attempt the task in the Abzu, where the right materials and facilities were available. Indeed, the two must have conducted experiments together there long before the suggestion was made at the assembly of the Anunnaki to let us make an Adamu in our image. Having reached the stage where genetic manipulation was sufficiently perfected to enable the determination of the resulting body's good or bad aspects, the two felt that they could master the final challenge, to mix the genes of hominids, not with those of other Earth creatures, but with the genes of the Anunnaki themselves. Using all the knowledge they had amassed, the two Elohim set out to manipulate and speed up the process of evolution. Modern man would have undoubtedly eventually evolved on Earth in any case, just as he had done on Nibiru, both having come from the same seed of life. But there was still a long way and a long time to go from the stage hominids were at 300,000 years ago to the level of development the Anunnaki had reached at that time. If, in the course of 4 billion years, the evolutionary process had been earlier on Nibiru just 1% of that time, evolution would have been 40 million years ahead on Nibiru compared with the course of evolution on Earth. Did the Anunnaki jump the gun on evolution on our planet by 1 million or 2 million years? No one can say for sure how long it would have taken Homo sapiens to evolve naturally on Earth from the earlier hominids, but surely 40 million years would have been more than enough time. In time, tiring of the constant need for birth goddesses, Enki engaged in a second genetic manipulation to enable the hybrid people to procreate on their own, and that brings us to our current version. So, when we consider the genetic manipulation of Earth primates to create workers, we can sum it up like this. They could not or did not wish to use artificial intelligence or robotic machines. They were already technologically advanced enough to genetically manipulate live organisms, and there was a plentiful supply of compatible hominids roaming freely across the planet. Basically, they could do it, and they did it. It's likely that simple. The ramifications of such a seemingly simple decision are also known collectively as our human history here on Earth. The aftermath of the Anunnaki GOLD acquisition endeavors on our planet has been both positive and negative, and the archive will explore the extent of each in Part 2.